Been an interesting day, Walshy. It's made a bit of news. This leaked email, which surfaced today from the WTA to its playing group. And we've seen plenty come out today. Martin Pakula, we've seen Martin Foley, we've seen others say nothing is a fait accompli right now. Nothing is absolutely settled in terms of unvaccinated tennis players coming to this country. Are you surprised, Walshy, the WTA put this out this early?
Look, not necessarily. If we go back a week or so ago, when I suppose the federal ministers Greg Hunt and Alex Hawke and Victorian Premier Dan Andrews last Tuesday or Wednesday said it was if you weren't vaccinated, you wouldn't be allowed entry into the country, and therefore you wouldn't be playing. It's certainly a storm created, but and a lot of it focused around Novak Djokovic, which is understandable given he's a 9-time Australian Open champion, and it came just a couple of days after he opted against divulging his vaccination status. So he was at the centre of the storm. If the 3-time defending champion's not on the way to Melbourne, what does that mean for the tournament, etc.? But in that same interview, Djokovic made it clear that he was expecting more information by the end of October. Now, quite a storm last week. I think people were surmising that Djokovic is not vaccinated. We don't know that for a fact. It's very, very important to state that we don't know for a fact that he's not vaccinated. It's possible that he could be, and that he's got a broader role as the head of the PTPA, so speaking on behalf of other players, just as he did last February in Melbourne, when the list of demands or the requests that he put was on behalf of a broader cohort of players, not himself. He was in Adelaide at the time. So no, not necessarily. The WTA need to get the information out to players. They need to know what's going on. We're a month out or so from the entries to, if the summer goes ahead as normal, the entries to those events will effectively be, closing sort of late November, the Aussie Open early December. So, things need to move fairly rapidly in the next few weeks. Now, if you have to get vaccinated to come to Australia, you'd want to be making sure you're doing that very early next month and then having your second shot.
But there seems to be, Walshy, there seems to be some mixed messaging, though. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, well, obviously we've got the state government and the federal government who have been coming at, and whether it's political posturing, I don't know, but they've come out and said, no, well, it's very highly unlikely that unvaccinated athletes are going to be coming into the country. We know it rests firstly with the federal government, and then the state government will come into play with what happens, certainly in Victoria, and what people can and can't do. But for that statement today to say that unvaccinated players will be allowed to play in Australia goes against what the government has said, the two governments.
Yes, to an extent. It certainly goes against what they said last week. We were also very mindful last week. Tennis Australia on the Wednesday, in a statement late in the day, said, we're still discussing this with the tours. We're still discussing this with the federal government. They were confident that it wasn't yet off the table, that this was certainly an ongoing discussion. And I think even today it's considered an ongoing discussion. Yes, it's at odds with what's been said, no doubt, last week, but perhaps those things weren't set in stone despite being said. Now, you do think that the view of a federal government minister is the view of the federal government at large, but the policy is not set in stone. And if we're welcoming in, well, not welcoming in, but if there will be unvaccinated Australians returning to Australia and going through the strict quarantine, the 14 days. So and I'm sure that will be the case, for Australians who are coming back not vaccinated. Now, I suppose it's the next step to say, for tourists, if you're not vaccinated, you're not allowed in. If that's the case, it should certainly be the same for the tennis players. If you're not vaccinated, you're not allowed in. But if it's not the case, and the people have to go and do 2 weeks of strict quarantine, I'm not so sure you can say there's a difference.
So how do you think, just in surmising, and we'll push on to some tennis, how do you think it's going to look?
I really don't know. I've got to say, I think there's still so much to go in terms of these negotiations. I would be surprised if the edict wasn't issued that if you're not vaccinated, you're not playing, you're not coming. I still think that has to be a logical step, but I'm not so sure that will happen. I do think that there'll be, there is some prospect that players will be able to come and do the hard quarantine. And because that will be from sort of early next month, early in December, there is a window for players who, if they want to opt to do that route, to then have the full summer I do think it's possible. But the other factor here, Brett, is, as pointed out by a lot of players, if you're not vaccinated and you serve the strict quarantine,
yep.
you're not going to have much of a good time anyway.
No,
because
sure.
are you allowed to stay in hotels? And what do you do? What if you're the driver, the tournament driver, for example?
Yeah.
Do you want to be taking someone that's not vaccinated? It's I think there's a lot of discussions, a lot of points. We've talked about the fans being vaccinated, having to be vaccinated, but there are tournament staff. There's so many people that are potentially exposed. So,
yep.
yeah, I still think that edict will go through, that if you're not vaccinated, you're not playing, but we'll wait and see.